Most people imagine biblical times as distant, sacred, almost untouchable, a world of halos and miracles, a landscape where prophets walked in constant clarity and ordinary life felt suspended between heaven and earth. But ancient life was not lived in stained glass, it was lived in dust. The Bible does not begin with temples, it begins with soil. Before there were kings, there were fields. Before there were scrolls, there were seasons. Before commandments were carved in stone, survival was carved into routine. If you want to understand what life was really like in biblical times, you must remove the glow and feel the weight. Start with the morning. There were no alarms, no artificial light to extend the night. Dawn determined rhythm. Families rose with the sun because daylight was currency. Work began early, not out of ambition, but necessity. Bread required grinding, water required carrying, fire required tending. Nothing came instantly. Every basic comfort was earned through effort, repeated daily. Homes were small, often one-room structures made of mud, brick, and stone. Roofs were flat, used for drying grain, praying, or sleeping in the summer heat. Privacy was rare. Life unfolded in proximity. Arguments were overheard, laughter carried across courtyards. Grief was communal because walls were thin and lives were intertwined. Water shaped everything. In many villages, women walked long distances to wells, balancing heavy jars on their heads. Wells were not only sources of water, but centers of social exchange. News spread there, alliances formed there, stories were repeated there. When Scripture describes someone meeting at a well, it is not coincidence. Wells were crossroads of daily existence. Food was simple, seasonal, and uncertain. Bread, olives, lentils, figs, fish when available. Meat was rare for most families and reserved for feasts or sacrifice. There were no supermarkets to smooth scarcity. If rain failed, hunger followed. Drought was not an inconvenience, it was a threat to survival. When the prophets spoke of famine, listeners did not imagine theory, they imagined empty storage jars and anxious nights. Children were not sheltered from reality. From an early age, they worked. They learned trades from parents. Boys followed fathers into fields or carpentry. Girls learned grinding, weaving, managing household rhythms. Education was oral before it was written. Stories carried memory. Genealogies preserved identity. To forget ancestry was to forget belonging. Disease was constant and poorly understood. A fever could become fatal. An infection could spread without remedy. Ritual purity laws were not abstract spiritual exercises. They functioned as public health boundaries in a world without antibiotics. When someone was declared unclean, it carried social and emotional cost. Isolation meant more than loneliness. It meant economic vulnerability. Travel was slow and dangerous. Journeys were measured in days on foot or by animal. Roads were uneven. Bandits were real. When Jesus tells a story about a man beaten on the road to Jericho, listeners did not treat it as metaphor. That road was known for violence. Distance created delay. News traveled by word of mouth. Rumors moved faster than certainty. Religious life was not confined to 1 hour a week. It structured time itself. Sabbaths interrupted productivity. Festivals required pilgrimage. Sacrifices required animals raised carefully over months. Faith was not private opinion, it was public rhythm. But religious devotion did not erase struggle. Many prayed without immediate answer. Many obeyed without visible reward. Psalms of lament exist because ancient believers felt abandonment as deeply as modern ones. How long was not rhetorical, it was a lived question. Gender roles were defined but demanding for both. Men carried responsibility for provision and protection. Failure could mean shame. Women carried the weight of household management, childbirth without modern medicine, and the expectation of continuity through children. Infertility was not simply medical, it was social stigma. When Scripture describes barrenness, it carries emotional gravity shaped by culture. Justice operated differently than modern courtrooms. Elders sat at city gates, disputes were heard publicly, reputation mattered, witnesses were crucial. There were laws about property boundaries, livestock damage, injury compensation. These were not primitive details. They reveal a society deeply concerned with order in a fragile environment. Slavery existed, complex and varied. Marriage was covenant and survival strategy. Romantic language appears in poetry, but most unions were negotiated for stability. Divorce carried serious consequence. Widowhood could mean poverty unless community intervened. Literacy was limited. Scrolls were expensive. Scribes held specialized skill. Most people encountered Scripture through hearing, not personal reading. Memory was sharpened because repetition was survival. Stories were recited around fires. Identity was shaped through listening. Community mattered more than individual ambition. Identity was collective. You belonged to tribe, clan, household. Decisions reflected family honor. Autonomy was secondary to continuity. To be cut off from community was devastating. Hospitality was sacred. To receive a stranger was moral obligation. Travelers depended on open doors. Refusing hospitality carried shame. In a land where journeys were perilous, generosity preserved life. And in that world, faith was not insulated from doubt. People questioned. They argued with God. They demanded explanation. Job's anguish was not exaggerated drama. It reflected genuine confusion in a world where suffering lacked easy answers. Miracles, when recorded, stood out precisely because they interrupted ordinary struggle. They were not daily convenience, but rare disruption. What often surprises modern readers is how recognizable ancient life feels beneath surface difference. People feared loss. They worried about provision. They navigated family tension. They experienced betrayal, ambition, jealousy, longing. Technology changed across centuries. Human response did not. Biblical times were not morally simpler. There was corruption, exploitation, greed. Prophets spoke against injustice because injustice existed. Markets could be dishonest. Judges could be bribed. Power could oppress. Yet there was also fierce resilience. People rebuilt after exile. They replanted after drought. They returned after defeat. They carried memory through displacement. They sang even when surrounded by uncertainty. Life was shorter. Many did not reach old age. Infant mortality was high. Each birth was a fragile hope. Each year survived was a quiet victory.
To live in biblical times meant living close to nature, close to community, close to risk, and close to faith. There was no illusion of control. Storms destroyed crops. Armies reshaped borders. Illness struck unpredictably. Dependence on God was not poetic language. It was survival posture. When Jesus spoke of seeds falling on different soils, listeners had planted. When he spoke of shepherds losing sheep, listeners had searched hillsides. When he spoke of debt forgiveness, listeners knew the suffocating weight of obligation. Biblical times were textured by dust, sweat, and prayer. They were not golden ages of constant miracle. They were ordinary days punctuated by extraordinary faith. And perhaps that rawness is why the stories endure. Not because ancient people were different, but because they were recognizably human. Biblical life answers not with fantasy, but with pattern. Fields, families, failure, faith, dust, and devotion. And in that dust, the same struggle we still face: how to live faithfully in a world that does not promise ease, only opportunity to respond. That was life in biblical times, not distant, not myth, but human.